got carried away. It's not an Arabi. Yeah. So sister was actually talking about living in Denmark and how uh, the situation in Palestine and how people are going to different marches, how that actually brought in the Muslim society, the Arabi society, and how that awakened the society into just remembering the double standards that one, the West and Western governments, or even many of the imperialist governments are actually living in regards to understanding human rights, understanding how we basically, or how they present the definition of human rights and the application of it on people in situations where, like the genocide, are they going to support Israel, or are they going to support human rights in supporting that what's happening in Gaza? Okay, so we are going to be doing, inshallah, Surah Al-An'am right there. We're going to be continuing. And we left off at this ayah. وَإِذَا جَاءَكَ الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِآيَاتِنَا فَقُلْ سَلَامٌ عَلَيْكُمْ كتب ربكم على نفسه الرحمة أنه من عمل منكم سوءا بجهالة ثم تاب من بعده وأصلح فأنه غفور رحيم. We left off at this one. Let's just kind of recap and I guess just remember and refresh our memory on what we were saying about this ayah. We talked about if those that believe would, if those that had believed, إِذَا جَاءَكَ الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِآيَاتِنَا, those that had believed in our verses, or in basically the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then tell them, Salamun alaykum, then tell them, peace be upon you. And we talked about Salamun alaykum, so we said that that was a way of invocating Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that basically these people that are the believers would get peace in their faith and peace in their health. And we talked about different kinds of peace. We talked about the peace in deen. We talked about the peace in the health. We talked about the peace in the mind. We talked about the peace in our families, and peace also in wealth. In other words, good income, and also basically good distribution. Okay, so when we're talking about Salamun alaikum, this is more comprehensive statement than a very particular statement. So it's Salamun alaikum, basically giving you the dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would grant you peace. كتب ربكم على نفسه الرحمة, for your Lord Almighty had ordained on himself a mercy. And we talked about the word kataba. Does the word kataba mean that it is to prevent forgetting? And then we said that no, it is in order to let the believers know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordained something. In other words, this is not something that will change, and that this is something that will be always in that way. And for the people and the believers basically to know that this is a statement that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had taken as an ordain, as a deal, as a promise, as a word that he will never change. So therefore it was written. So the word kataba actually means written. So it was written, and it said rabbukum. When it said rabbukum, it didn't say kataballahu ala nafsihi ar-rahma. It said rabbukum. What's the difference between kataba rabbukum and kataballah? If you say katab Allah, even though, yes, at the end of the day, Allah is really a Rabb, but when you say kataba rabbukum, that's in order to remind you that the one that cherishes you is basically the one that had ordained mercy upon himself. That's in order to remind you that all the different things that you are living in, that surround you, that basically give you the life that you are living right now, which is your Lord Almighty, the one that's cherishing you with everything, is basically the same one that's giving you the mercy. أَنَّهُ مَنْ عَمِلَ مِنْكُمْ سُوءًا, and based on this mercy, for whoever commits any evil deed. And when you say su, You're talking about any type of transgression. You're talking about any type of a distance that one may actually transgress and go beyond the principles of the Lord Almighty. Bijahala. And we went in details with the word bijahala, so they would commit the sin, but there's a jahala. And we said there's a difference between jahila, somebody that may not know something, that is unaware of something, and something that is jahala, and therefore the action itself actually contained some form of not forgetting. They know the ruling, but they did not necessarily embrace it at the time. So in other words, it's not that they were ignorant of the ruling, but they behaved in ignorance. But they behaved in ignorance. They behaved the same way as an ignorant person, ignorant about the ruling, would probably behave in, and they had completely forgotten it. They had completely forgotten, not to mean forgotten, meaning that they cannot recall the information, but forgotten to actually mean that they had pacified themselves away from being aware of the actual ruling that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said. Now, one thing, we went in details about bijahala. We said jahila is different than jahiliya. And if a person acts in jahiliya, certainly in a lot of the translations, they might translate the word jahiliya to mean prophetic era, or the time that was before the life of the Prophet ﷺ, or before basically the Prophet ﷺ being a prophet, but that doesn't really contain the complete definition, because if you look at Jahiliyyah, can Jahiliyyah actually happen during our times today? The answer is absolutely. And this ayah really tells us that Jahiliyyah, anything that goes beyond the limits of the Lord Almighty, is actually considered Jahiliyyah. So in practice, we would talk about the concept itself. If the person distances or practices a behavior that is distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that itself is jahiliyyah. And that's what this ayah would basically tell us of. If a person had committed any transgression against the Lord Almighty's principle, that would basically be jahiliyyah. Okay, then the ayah continues. So this person did know the rule. It's not that they didn't know the rule, because if the person had not known the rule, and in a situation, now I want you just to keep in mind, because many times people would say, well, I don't want to attend Islamic classes because if I would know the rule, then I would be held accountable. And if I am not aware of the rule, that I wouldn't be held accountable. Well, that's a very, very wrong statement. It's an absolutely wrong statement, because if that was the case, then we would be considered as basically a very good, let's say, a very good excuse is to stay ignorant. But if a person does not attend the classes, and under the pretense that this is in order to save them from being held accountable, then they're actually held accountable twice. One, for committing the sin; two, for inducing ignorance. Number three. So this is two sins, not one sin. Number three, if a person has access to knowing the ruling, then being ignorant about it is actually not giving that person, let's say, the dismissal from being held accountable because they had access to knowing the ruling. That's exactly when we would say the government basically telling you there's this order, and once it becomes something that was signed in the Constitution, or something that was probably announced in as part of the law, then in that situation everybody is asked to practice that regardless of you hearing about it or not. Once it goes out in that journal, once it basically is released, then it becomes mandatory for everyone to apply it. You not knowing about the ruling does not give you the exception or the permission to say, "Well, I didn't know that you cannot cross a red light." Well, you basically had gotten your license, you live in a society that has certain laws, and therefore, you not knowing and claiming to not know the law, as long as it was released, you were supposed to do your responsibility and your duty to know the rule. To say, "Well, I didn't know that we were supposed to pay taxes or that we were supposed to do this and this or whatever it is," that does not give you whatsoever the dismissal or somehow pardon you from the implication for that rule. That's the same thing. So when we're talking about the jahala itself, that doesn't mean that the person is ignorant of the rule, but that simply means that the person, keep that in mind, the person had been pacified away from remembering the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or being, let's call it at that moment, being vigilant, being aware, being conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rules. So just keep that one in mind in how we put these pieces together. Then thumma taba. Now, when you look at the word thumma, that actually takes me to another hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, لا يزني الزاني وهو مؤمن. A person that commits zina does not do it when they were in a state of iman. Well, wait a minute. Does that mean that they were in a state of kufr? No. When you say لا يزني الزاني وهو مؤمن, it basically means that the person that is committing a sin, when they were committing and while they were committing the sin, their level of faith basically drops from the level of faith of Iman, which keeps them completely and totally aware of the Lord Almighty, to the level of Islam at the moment. Why did you say the level of Islam and not the level of kufr? Well, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us in numerous ayat, just because somebody committed a sin, that does not get them out of the fold of Islam. But that can get them out of the fold of Iman. Just remember that one. What's the difference? The fold of Iman is more of a spiritual fold. It's more of a spiritual level. The fold of Islam is that you're either in Islam or you're out of Islam. You're either a Muslim or you're either a Kafir. If you say you're in Islam, that actually means mentally, and your recognition is basically to recognize that there's no God worthy of worship but Allah. You recognize Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. You recognize Judgment Day. You recognize the things that relate to Judgment Day in terms of Jannah, Nar, Malaika, all of that you recognize and you believe in it. Okay. So that recognition is within more of mental piece of it. But the Iman is more of a heart embracement. أن تؤمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله. This is more of a heart embracement, that the person is basically completely conscious of that. So when you're talking about لا يزني الزاني وهو مؤمن, in other words, their level of faith had dropped by that action. There's no way that while the person is committing that sin, that major sin, that they could say that they had this awareness, this conscious, or this relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, then when you look at the word thumma, that actually tells us that there was some time lapse. But for a mu'min, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually tells us in Surah Ali Imran that for the believers, إِذَا مَسَّهُمْ طَائِفٌ مِّنَ الشَّيْطَانِ, So for a person that is high in faith, even if they have طائف من الشيطان, what is a طائف? A طائف is kind of like a shadow. الشيطان didn't overcome that person, but it was just the beginning. But a believer, the person that is high in faith, we're talking about a mu'min now. What happens is that طائف من الشيطان, even though it's just a small shadow that probably had come past them, but then what do? Well, basically تذكروا. They would just say the dhikr, whether it's أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, or they would remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then فإذا هم مبصرون. That's when they're capable of seeing the right from wrong. They're capable of defining everything. They're capable of actually seeing all the different things based on the concept of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, that's a mu'min. Okay, just put that one in mind when you look at ثم تاب. So this person that عمل السوء بجهالة is basically the person that had deeply engaged. So we're talking about somebody that deeply engaged in sin, then later they had repented to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we talked about the four conditions of tawbah. We talked about the four conditions of tawbah. We said number one is that the person regrets what they had done. Number two, makes istighfar, seeks forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number three, they basically determine not to go back to this behavior. Number four, they would put in a new good action. And that's that number four right there to tell us, okay, now they would basically be determined to completely change the lifestyle that they were living in. So that's why وَأَصْلَحَ. So we talked about أصلح. We said that the person entered a new state, had determined to enter a state of piety, a state on the terms of not jahala, but on the terms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I would also like to note that the difference between the jahala and the islah is basically one key thing. When you look at the ayat, quite interesting. We did go, I believe, in Surah An-Nisa, was it? In Surah An-Nisa, I believe we went, or maybe Surah Al-Ma'idah. I can't remember. I think it was Surah Al-Ma'idah, maybe. But we went in details with the word jahiliyyah and jahala. So get to see that. Find it, and hopefully you'll be able to find the notes in regards to jahiliyyah and all of that. But we had mentioned one thing is that with jahiliyyah, there's a deep inclination to one's desire and one's whims. But with al-islah, there are two things that are working. Here, al-jahiliyyah is dependent on dhann, is dependent on doubt, is dependent on speculation, okay, in terms of the at least the idea of it, and in terms of the practice, it's dependent on whims. Islah is dependent on two things similar, but maybe we should draw this line and just see what we're talking about, right? Let's do that comparison. Hold on, what are we going to do? We're going to annotate. I'm just going to write something right there. Okay, so we're talking about the vision. Okay, if we're talking about the vision of it, so the first one is, let's write that down. The first one is dhann, which basically means speculation. Well, speculation and basically a completely wrong vision in understanding the world around you. Okay, and in terms of the practice of it, it's going to be practice based on desire. If you look at atheism, it's quite interesting that atheists are actually the most to talk about faith, ironically. You know why? It's quite funny. The ones to talk about faith and be ardent in attacking faith and attacking religion are actually the atheists. It's like, okay, if you're an atheist and you're so much in firm belief of atheism, just let people be. And why are you concerned about what faith they have and how they believe in whatever faith that they believe in? In other words, deism. Why are you so concerned to prove to others that God doesn't exist? Well, that's really because they themselves are in doubt of it. They themselves are actually in doubt of that. So if they were really in firm belief, it's like, okay, well, you believe that there's no objective morality. You believe that God doesn't exist. Just live your life, man. Leave people alone, right? But just because they're actually in full skepticism of that idea itself, there was actually a very interesting study. I can't remember exactly in which country it was done in. I think it was, I can't remember. Don't take my word for that. I can't remember if it was Sweden or Switzerland, but anyhow, there was this study that was actually done on atheists. And when the word God is mentioned, that's by 67%, the level of fear went up. It's like, okay, 67%, the level of fear went up when you heard the word God, but you were supposed to be an atheist. So, and I can't remember if it's Switzerland or Sweden, one of those let's say, highly atheist countries. That's where the study was done in. Anyhow, so when you look at al-Jahiliyyah, it actually comes from the basis in terms of vision, in terms of understanding the world, basically comes from speculation. And the practice of it is desire. Okay. And if you see, going back to atheists, for example, the main thing that they would want to get out of attacking religions is to give themselves the justification to basically commit all those different desires without feeling guilty. That's the key thing, is that they don't want to feel guilty of what they are committing, so they want to convince others to get other people's approval that what they are claiming is basically true. In other words, they themselves are actually living in doubt of their own statement. Let's go for in comparison with the believer. For the believer, in order to be in the parameter of aslaha or salah and piety, you would basically need again two things. The vision is supposed to be based on wahi. In other words, revelation. It's supposed to be based on the standards of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And uh, in order to in order to live that al-wahi in practice, it's basically going to be based on the terms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, it's the practice is not going to be based on desire, but is actually going to be based on yaqeen, or it's going to be based on the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, as-salah. Okay, so the principles are supposed to be, in the case of a mu'min, is supposed to be based on the piety that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had defined as piety. From where? From al-wahi, not from your own definition. Because you want to keep in mind that even for an atheist, for example, there is no resource that they could say cannibalism is a bad idea. There's no way that you can prove that cannibalism is a bad idea. Just eating human beings and eating human body, and probably instead of killing these people, maybe we could just basically consume their bodies. For an atheist, you don't have a reference to why this is a bad idea. And all the different definitions of morality were really plagiarized from religion. Because for an atheist, why would cannibalism and why not eating people is a bad idea? Why is it a bad idea? Why is killing bad? Well, you could say because the law says so. Well, what if the law changes? Will that make it good? Will that make it okay? What is the definition of ethics? What is the definition of justice? For an atheist, we're just matter in motion, and therefore, there's no such thing as an objective morality. So when you compare the two, okay, What about Christianity? What about Judaism? What about Hinduism? When we speak about speculation, okay, we're speaking about we're speaking about just not having, let's say, an authentic resource in understanding what it means to do the right thing. Okay. So with Judaism and Christianity, well, Christianity basically depends on the Old Testament, at least to a great extent in terms of legislation, or at least the principles. Okay, but in the end, it does definitely contain some truth, not all the truth, but definitely they don't necessarily have detailed laws of in legislation. And that's why in different parts of the Muslim world, uh, the Christians actually go for the Muslim court in cases of dispute. Believe it or not, even in Palestine, Christians actually go to the Muslim court. And even in Jordan, things that relate to, for example, that relate to some dispute, possibly in inheritance, etc. A lot of times they would actually go to the Muslim court because there's nothing that they could depend on in order to solve their matters. And if you look at the Jewish laws are basically a lot more detailed than Muslim laws, by the way. You would think the opposite, but no. Jewish laws are actually way more detailed than Muslim laws in terms of at least specific, very, very specific details. Alhamdulillah that Islam gave more general rulings than actually very, very particular rulings. Okay, let's see. But of course, al-wahi is basically the basis for salah. That's why when we say amana wa aslaha, always that faith comes first in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَأَنَّهُ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. For the Lord Almighty is all forgiving and all merciful. Okay. And I think the sister actually put an A. أَفَحُكْمَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ يَبْغُونَ وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ مِنَ اللَّهِ حُكْمًا لِقَوْمٍ يُوقِنُونَ. You're absolutely right. So when we're speaking about those that would seek the Jahiliyyah, in other words, the rulings of Jahiliyyah, and they recognize وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ حُكْمًا مِنَ اللَّهِ أَحْسَنُ مِنَ اللَّهِ حُكْمًا. There's no one to rule better than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than, of course, لِقَوْمِ يُوقِنُونَ. Why لِقَوْمِ يُوقِنُونَ? Because they don't have yaqeen in whatever laws that they might be putting down, because all the different laws that they would be basically putting down, they're not in full belief in those laws, because of course they would recognize that we needed to change it. The situation changed, or there could be political pressure or cultural pressure to change the law or change the principles. And then of course it becomes something that they themselves are not certain of. Okay, and we said that this ayah had also forbidden the Prophet ﷺ. We didn't actually go in details. We just generally talked about this ayah. And let's just see what Al-Qurtubi said here. Al-Qurtubi said that this ayah was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ basically to forbid him from repelling or kicking away, or at least, I guess, turning away those that had started with Assalamu alaikum. So what happened? So then the Prophet ﷺ had said, Alhamdulillah الذي جعل في أمتي من أمرني أن أبدأهم بالسلام. Alhamdulillah, all the praise due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He had made uh, uh, from my nation, who the Lord Almighty had ordered me to start with as-salam, peace with them. In other words, to salute them in peace. And the Prophet ﷺ, what is that supposed to mean? That the Prophet ﷺ himself was basically happy to bring about this endorsement. So if the Prophet ﷺ would tell you Salaam alaikum, that's actually a dua. Okay. That's an invocation. Just imagine if the Prophet ﷺ would tell you Assalamu alaikum. That's an endorsement. That's a dua that the Prophet ﷺ is making for you that you would live in peace. Man, that would have been such an honor, right? So the Prophet ﷺ would say, Alhamdulillah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given me this privilege to basically tell the people around him and his a group of his nation to tell them Assalamu alaikum. Just imagine. Okay. In other words, what does that mean? That's actually like coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving the Prophet ﷺ the permission to tell them Assalamu alaikum, that's from one end, that's an endorsement from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that yes, these people deserve it. These people are in a position to deserve it. And that's why appreciating, respecting, honoring the Sahaba is faith. Honoring the Sahaba is faith. Because just remember, these are the people that fully embraced the light of al-Wahy. They had seen it. They had lived it. They had basically seen it in practice with the Prophet ﷺ. So it's pretty sad to see, for example, Shia or probably others actually speak of Amr ibn al-As or Sayyida Aisha or Abu Huraira or etc. and not recognize that these people are actually honorable people that even the Prophet ﷺ had anointed with salam, that had given them a special place to be, whether it's Mu'awiyah ibn Abi Sufyan to be from Kuttab al-Wahy, or whether it's Amr ibn al-As, the Prophet ﷺ had given him the honor to be the leader in Ghazwat al-Salasul, or whether it's Abu Sufyan, each one, the Prophet ﷺ had basically overseen who these people are. And the Prophet ﷺ was given al-Wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is an endorsement coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لَقَدْ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِذْ يُبَايِعُونَكَ تَحْتَ الشَّجَرَةِ فَعَلِمَ مَا فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ. قد رضي الله. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is content over who? المؤمنين. إذ يبايعونك تحت الشجرة فعلم ما في قلوبهم. He knew what was in their hearts. فعلم ما في قلوبهم. You know what was in their hearts. So therefore, honoring the Sahaba is basically key to honoring even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, let's see. All right. So let's continue right there. Another hadith in Sahih Muslim. Let's say that Abu Sufyan had come to Salman. Remember this one. So who's Abu Sufyan? Abu Sufyan, of course, was considered the main chieftain who was leading the fight and leading basically the armies that were fighting the Prophet ﷺ from pretty much day one. Okay. So Abu Sufyan happens to be the main figure. Abu Jahl, yes, he was part of that, but later, of course, Abu Jahl died, and so did al-Mughira, so did, many of those chieftains. But Abu Sufyan was the key chieftain that continued to the end. Okay. But Abu Sufyan passes by. That was before he had become Muslim, because later on, Abu Sufyan had become Muslim. Later on, Abu Sufyan even loses his eye in a battle for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Abu Sufyan later becomes a Sahabi and hasuna Islam. And even his Islam he was a mujahid, okay? Yes, he had a history of fighting the Prophet ﷺ, but later he had a later history, or a later future at least, at that time we're talking about, of fighting with the Prophet ﷺ in major battles. Okay, let's see. And he's also the father of Mu'awiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. I would like to note that the history of the Dawla al-Umayyah, of the Umayyad nation had been, I would say, poorly written by the other or the generations later to come. And I would say there is a very important, and you can actually get that as an audio book. It was about الدولة الأموية and all the contributions that الدولة الأموية had done, and it was written by Ahmed Shalabi. Ahmed Shalabi, I did actually talk about him before. Ahmed Shalabi, he studied at Cambridge University when Cambridge University was considered Harvard today, okay? And he basically specialized in history, and he was actually one of the best students, and later also taught there, and later on went back to Egypt. He's originally Egyptian. The books that he had written are probably the key books at the time, at least at the time, for a lot of those books on how to write about history, and certainly did an outstanding job in defending a lot of the different things in history and exposing, keep this one in mind, this one, pay attention to this one, exposing the attempts in poorly writing history in an attempt to basically create a certain ideology. Okay, keep that one in mind, because the ones that write history are the ones to shape people's identity towards a certain legacy. Keep that one in mind. Because when you see, for example, a certain group of people talk about, for example, the Ottoman Empire as the sick man, or as the country that distributed or basically supported shirk and all of that, and write about the Uthmani Khilafah, you could see that the extreme hate on the Uthmani Khilafah was actually coming from a motive that was not innocent at all. And certainly we were many times educated by the imperialist countries, by the colonizers. They wanted us to basically see the Ottoman Empire, or see the Khilafah, or see our Islamic history as nothing but a dark age. To not see it as something that we relate to in our identity, to not see it as something that is part of us, to not see it as a legacy we must revive, but then they will shape it to us as something that was nothing of a dark age, something that was nothing but bloodshed and killing, and therefore it should be nothing for you to be proud of. And in contrast to how they presented that, they presented basically the European history as being basically Voltaire, and being the one that brings in the Enlightenment and so forth, and then making us feel that we need to aspire to become like the Europeans, like the West, and not like the dark ages of the Muslim history. Okay, now this is a very poorly written side of history, and this is very dangerous and definitely contains a lot of fallacies. And that's where Ahmed Chalabi comes in. And I think he really didn't get the appreciation that he deserves. Ahmed Chalabi then talks about الدولة الأموية and all the different contributions that they had contributed for the Muslim history, and all the different things in relationship to the Ummah today, and even the Islamic history, and how their contribution was actually the foundation to a lot of the Islam that we are living in today. So you want to really take that in consideration and be careful from the poorly written piece of history. Studying history is studying Aqidah. Keep that one in mind. Studying history is studying Aqidah. And it's really sad that we barely have institutions that focus on teaching the Muslims history, even though that's actually Aqidah. When you learn history, you basically learn one, vision, how it was applied, who opposed it, how you live your identity today, what shaped it, who shaped it, who shaped your vision of what's right and what's wrong, who shaped the society that we're living in today, why, what was practiced, how did we get into what we're in today? Those that cannot remember history, those that don't have any lens to look back in history are definitely very myopic in their vision, in understanding the world that they're living in today, in understanding their own identity, their own legacy, and therefore those that don't know their DNA, they don't know their history, are basically going to be doomed to committing a lot of the different mistakes that happened before. Learning history is part of learning your identity. Learning who wrote your history is giving you awareness to learn about who's writing about you, who's reshaping your vision about yourself. Because if I convinced you that you're vicious, and I convinced you that you are stupid simply because of your color, or that you cannot be as intelligent as the white man, etc., and you're convinced that way, you got a key problem here. You got a key problem because you're letting others define you, define your identity, and you're living based on their definition. And those that live in slavery and cannot see the shackles around their hands are worse than the ones that are living in slavery, seeing the shackles in their hands. Because the ones that see the shackles in their hands, at least they recognize it and they will stand to be strong to attempt to break it. But the ones that are living in shackles, but they cannot see it, they're basically not going to attempt to remove it because they can't even see it. Remember what Harriet Tubman said? She said that she would have been capable of freeing a lot more if they were convinced that they were slaves, or that slavery was not good for them. But she couldn't because they had the mindset already right there built that this was okay. And that's the same thing. In order to correct the mindset, the implication, you really got to correct the mindset first. Okay, let's continue. So we're talking about Abu Sufyan. That's what dragged us to talking about الدولة الأموية. Okay, Abu Sufyan comes to Salman, Suhaib. Salman is basically Salman al-Farisi. Suhaib, Bilal, and Nafar. Nafar actually means another group of Sahaba. And who is this? Abu Sufyan, basically the chieftain. He comes to them. And then what do they say? Well, they say something really dangerous. Okay, what do they say? They said, you know what? Our swords did not take enough of your neck, the enemy of Allah. In other words, what are they saying? They're right there. They're right there attacking the guy. They're right there threatening the guy. And who is this guy? This is a chieftain. And what are they saying? They're our swords. Wait till they go around your neck. Whoa, that's right there. Abu Sufyan is walking by and they're right there. And who were these? Well, they were ex-slaves. And here they are, they're telling a chieftain like that. Now, who passes by? Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq passes by and he said, did you actually tell this old man of Quraysh? And he was basically a chieftain and Sayyidahum, even one of their leaders. Did you actually tell him that? Then he was angry at them, obviously. But he goes to the Prophet ﷺ That is Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And then he says, that is the Prophet ﷺ tells Abu Bakr, did you provoke them? In other words, did you get them angry? If you had gotten them angry, then you had gotten your Lord angry. Abu Bakr goes then to them, and then he says, brothers, did I get you angry? And then they said, no. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive you, brother. Huh. So what does that mean? That actually is teaching us a lesson how to honor the Sahaba. If Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, when we're talking about as-Siddiq, we're actually talking about one of the most important Sahaba that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually called as-Siddiq. He is that Sahabi that is the one to have the highest level of sidq, the highest level of honesty, the highest level that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would endorse his faith. And the Prophet ﷺ tells him, did you get them angry? If you did, then you got Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala angry at you. And then Abu Bakr as-Siddiq goes and basically goes to them and just makes sure that they were not angry at him. But look at the response. يغفر لك. They, even though Bakr as-Siddiq, scolded them, and that was a whole hard way to scold them. You're attacking a person, but then they're like, yeah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive you. Don't worry about it. Look at that. Look at the adab. Look at the adab that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq comes in, and the adab that the Sahaba responded in. It's like, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive you. Don't worry about it. Right? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive you. All right. So what does that actually reflect? That reflects the importance and the honor of those Sahaba. And basically, احترام الصالحين. Stop. احترام who? الصالحين. What does that mean? من عاد لي وليا فقد أذنته بالحرب. Well, what does that mean? You're an enemy to a wali. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَدَافِعُ عَنِ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that supports the believers, is the one that defends the believers. If you are to attack a believer, then you had waged a war on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So respecting and honoring the Salihin and keeping away from what would harm them is basically part of faith. Just keep that one in mind. And remember when we talked about last time, وَلَا تَطْرُدِ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ. We were talking about the circles or the orbits. We called them the orbits. The orbits of the different people that surround you. Basically, you've got an orbit of people that you would relate to in faith, of people that you would relate to in your life, family, etc., and of people that you would relate to in school, possibly, and others that you would relate to in business, and blah, 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 all of those things. We talked about these orbits, and that's the same thing. There's an orbit, احترام الصالحين. There's an orbit. There's صالحين, and the pious people. Giving and honoring الصالحين basically is going to affect how you relate with the people and with the people that surround you and who you put in within your orbit. Just keep that one in mind. Who's actually inside your orbit? If within your orbit, you basically are surrounding yourself with those that are يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ, with those that would invoke their Lord Almighty throughout the night and throughout the day, that's going to rub on you. That's going to affect you. That's going to rub on you. It's going to basically influence you. And the beginning of being part of a Salihin, Shafi'i used to say, I'm not from the Salihin, but loving the Salihin is in itself success. Why is he saying I'm not from the Salihin? He doesn't want to be included in them? No, he cannot endorse himself because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَكُمْ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنِ اتَّقَى. Don't endorse yourself. Don't praise yourself. For the Lord Almighty really is the one to know who the true believers are. هو أعلم بمن اتقى. He knows who the true believers are. So ولا تزكوا أنفسكم. But he said, I'm not from the Salihin, but I would be around the Salihin because just by being around them, that in itself is actually success. So just surrounding yourself with Salihin, and the shaitan will come in and tell you that you're a hypocrite. You don't belong with these people because you know you have sin. You know you have sin. You know they're better than you. And you know that you hang out around them, that making you seem like and making you think that you are part of them, but you're nothing but a person of sin. You shouldn't be hanging around with those people because you don't belong around them because you're a person of sin. That's what shaitan will tell you. But no, surround yourself with the salihin because that in itself is going to give you the barakah, barakat al-salihin. The barakah. What does that mean? The barakah of the salihin. Barakat al-salihin can mean nur, can mean knowledge, can mean inspiration. They will inspire you by you seeing what they're doing. You see a salih person, they're doing the dhikr. You see a salih person, you see a salih person doing the dhikr. You see a salih person basically memorizing Quran. You see a salih person basically practicing maybe talab al-ilm, maybe practicing Islam in different ways. That in itself is an inspiration. That inspiration in itself is barakah. عشان أعطيهم. That in itself is an inspiration. That inspiration will rub on you. That's the barakah. Barakatul salihin does not necessarily mean, even though it can be included, okay? But it's not necessarily exclusive. It's not exclusive to speaking about blessings as a hidden thing, even though it can be included. Dua, for example, their dua is a barakah, meaning there's a connection between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's a connection between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It will affect you, whether it's the dua that the salih person might do, or perhaps maybe there's a story that I really like. So Shafi'i, of course, the legend says this story. We don't have authentic evidence to to have a chain of narration to tell us whether this story is true or not, but it was told. Okay. What does the story say? That Shafi'i went to visit Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So he goes to visit Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and then Ahmad ibn Hanbal puts him food, and then he eats it. And then he goes and eats again and again and again. And of course, Ahmad ibn Hanbal's maid basically comments, why is he eating? If he was a real believer, he would have just eaten just a small amount. But then when he was asked, he said that the reason why I had eaten from it is basically the halal in it, the barakah in it, and I wanted that to basically be what fills me. إله يا ماما مش إلي. إله يا ماما أعطيه مية عطشان. ادوية بس ادوية خفيف خفيف. Okay. All right, here we go. Let's continue. Sorry about that. So when we're speaking about barakat al-salihin, we're speaking about 1, the dua, 2, the ilm, 3, the influence, and 4, certainly the barakah itself, the environment, all of that. We're speaking about different areas of barakah. Okay. Does that mean that when we're speaking about blessings, we're speaking about barakah, we're speaking about something like Christians would believe in, or Sufis would believe in, that they would have like a miracle and a blessing to probably make something maybe more or something like that. So when we speak about barakah, this can be included to probably having certain let's say blessings included, meaning that something would be added, something good, etc. All of those different things, they can be included in the blessings, but of course, we don't want to just consider that blessing in terms of quantity of items or the miracles of things, but we're also talking about what is even more inspirational, which is what actually affects the dua, the person's iman, and all of that, that's something that we would agree on. That's something that we would agree on in terms of barakat al-salihin. Okay, let's continue right there. So, احترام اجتناب ما يغضبهم أو يؤذيهم. Avoiding what would make them angry is part of al-iman. So, for example, talking about them, maybe exaggerating sins that they had committed. Yes, certainly, it doesn't mean that they are free of sin. No one would say that they are free of sin, but we would basically say that at the end, our duty is not to expose people's sins, whether it's a salih person or not. Your duty is not to expose people's sin. And to expose people's sins is basically a sin in itself. Ibn Abbas had said a different narration. He said that this ayah was revealed in regards to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Umar ibn al-Khattab, and Uthman ibn Affan and Ali ibn Abi Talib. Let's go look at number 6 and see. He said al-Baghawi had mentioned it, Ibn al-Jawzi had mentioned it, and it was narrated upon Ibn Ata. Okay? Or, yeah, well, he said Ata. And basically exclusive. Who are these Sahaba anyways? So these 4 Sahaba are basically the 4 Khulafa al-Rashidin: Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Uthman ibn Affan, and Ali ibn Abi Talib. Okay, let's see. Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad. Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad, he said, a group of Muslims came to the Prophet ﷺ and they said, we had committed sin, so make the invocation, make the dua for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us. Then the Prophet ﷺ basically turned away and this ayah was revealed. You could see al-Muharrar al-Wajiz, that's basically for Ibn Atiyah. He had mentioned that al-Fudayl ibn Iyad. Wait a minute, so who's al-Fudayl ibn Iyad? Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad was a very interesting figure, by the way. Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad actually had a history of being a gang member. Yeah. And then later, he basically repented and became a scholar. You just think of that. Just think of that. And by the way, those that sometimes have a murky past may actually be the most influencers later on. Okay. Just keep that one in mind. And I'm not saying don't judge, because if somebody is doing the wrong thing, we're definitely supposed to be judging that this is wrong. Okay. Not to say, yeah, well, let's not judge them. No, we have to judge. It's our duty. And the idea that tells us not to be judgmental is actually coming from a completely different atheistic culture. That atheistic culture, basically postmodernism, that tells you that everything is relative, therefore you shouldn't be judging because you don't have any standard in defining truth. That's basically completely in complete opposition. That's completely against Islam. No, we've got certain standards, and certain standards would come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Certain standards would define for us what's a major sin, what's a minor sin, and basically what's a salih, what's a fasiq, what's a mu'min, etc. And it basically, hey, tells us those things. Are we capable of judging whether that person is going to go to Jannah or Jahannam? The answer is no, absolutely not. But we are required to put in these parameters to help us recognize and define whether we're seeing those practices around us, whether they are in the parameter of what would lead to hellfire, or whether they were in the parameter of what would lead to Jannah. Okay, we have to be judgmental, because if you're not being judgmental, then to you, everything is basically going to be relative. And if everything is relative, then that's basically coming from the basis of atheism, which regards there's no definition to objective morality. Ustaz Umayy, you wanted to say something, dear?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa
Alaikum salam.
So, not judging, but not criticizing, right?
Judging but not criticizing. Why
The
not?
person.
Why can't we criticize if something is wrong?
Oh,
We have to be critical.
criticize. It's not backbiting.
So there's a difference between, so I see, for example, if we're talking about, let's say, somebody is smoking in the masjid. Okay, let's just use that one. Okay, if I'm gonna say, okay, I'm gonna try to be nice and let's say tell that sister, hey sister, the masjid is a place of worship, and if you may, please honor the place of worship and do not smoke in the masjid, for example. Okay, honor the masjid, do not smoke in the masjid, and plus it's haram because it's a mufattir, because it harms your body. Islam is asking you to not harm your body, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So that's, what am I doing? Am I judging or am I being critical? It's both. I'm being critical, otherwise I would not have come to recognize that smoking in the masjid was not the right thing to do.
So
I'm being critical. Then I went to judge. But if I'm here probably mocking the sister, okay, mocking the sister to somehow humiliate her, then that's a different story. If you're humiliating her just for the sake of, yeah, somehow feeling superior, then that's definitely a problem.
So
That's definitely a problem.
So the correct word is to say that advise her, not criticize her.
Absolutely. I would also want to mention that there's a difference between individual behavior and between, let's call it, public behavior. What do I mean by that? Public figure. Okay. If I'm judging a public figure, like let's say, for example, we're speaking about a public figure, I don't know, a leader, okay, a person in, let's say, a high position in leadership, okay? And I'm basically being critical of course, certain things that they had probably approved of, or certain things that they were doing. That scrutiny that I would put a public figure in is different in its terms than putting an individual in, let's call it, in a private situation. If we're talking about just a random person, the terms that we would deal with a public figure is completely different. So it would not be ghaiba, okay, for me to judge or criticize publicly, for example, MBS, or speak about, I don't know, Ibn Abbas, Mahmoud Ibn Abbas, or Mahmoud Abbas, Mahmoud Ibn Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas, for example. Okay, it would not be Mahmoud Ibn Abbas. I can't believe I said Mahmoud Ibn Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas.
Relative to Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
Sorry about that. Okay, would not be considered as ghaiba, because this person is holding a public position, and therefore when I would criticize their public position, I would criticize basically what they are doing. This involves us. This involves you and I. This involves the ummah. This isn't me talking about him, just because, I don't have anything personal I don't have anything personal between me and MBS or, okay. All right, nothing personal. So it's not a personal issue here, but this is actually an issue of faith. So if it's an issue of faith, that's a completely different thing. Okay. If it's a completely different term. I'm basically judging their stance in regards to their accountability to the ummah, not to themselves. This isn't, just a relationship between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No, this is a relationship between us as well, the ummah. That's a completely different term. You understand what I'm saying?
Jazakallah khairan.
وإياكم. Okay. So it was also, this one's quite interesting. He said ruwiya. Ruwiya is giving us an indication that that's not necessarily authentic. Let's see. عن أنس بن مالك مثله سواء. So that Anas ibn Malik basically gave the same narration, gave a similar narration that a group of Sahaba, they basically had come to the Prophet ﷺ and confessed of committing certain sins, and that they had asked the Prophet ﷺ to pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for their forgiveness, and the Prophet ﷺ just turned away. But that's when the ayah basically was revealed. So even if somebody had committed a major sin, you have a responsibility to make the dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would forgive them, no matter what type of sin that is. That's when we would say don't judge. Okay? That's when we would say don't judge. Is that you never know. This person might have actually embraced repentance and was committed to it and determined to basically do that repentance. Then that's when we would say, if the person is showing this type of remorse, that's when we would say you cannot judge. Okay? Once the person كتب ربكم على نفسه الرحمة. كتب ربكم, meaning that he had obligated, ordained, basically with the information that he had sent us and the true promise that he had revealed onto or through al-Wahy, that in order for the people to know that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained something, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made that as mandatory on himself, in other words, obligated on himself, that this would be nothing that would change whatsoever. And another opinion basically said to say kataba, meaning written. Now remember, the word kataba actually means written. The second opinion basically said kataba to mean that it was written in al-lawh al-mahfuz. Al-lawh al-mahfuz is basically, remember, it's like the tablet that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had written al-ghayb in it. And certainly part of that whoever does bijahala. Now here's the question. So we did say bijahala, and we went in some details about jahala, that it's not necessarily being ignorant, but it's committing something and at a moment when the person is not fully embracing the spiritual piece of faith, which we call the iman. Okay, but let's see if al-Qurtubi says the same thing. The first opinion, he basically said that was involving committing a sin without intending to do so. The second opinion, that he basically did not know the difference between halal and haram, and therefore they had committed the sin. They had committed the sin when they were ignorant about that sin. Okay. And he said that we went in details in Surah An-Nisa in regards to that tafsir. All right, let's see. Another interpretation, he said, whoever, so al-jahiliyyah would be a person that basically rushed al-ajil ala al-akhirah. So what does that mean? That actually takes us to, let's see which surah. تؤثرون الحياة الدنيا على الآخرة. Hold on. So that would be, let's just remember 143 on this page. And we're going to go to Surah Al-Insan because that's where he's taking me. Let's see, Surah Al-Insan. Okay. And he's definitely taking me to Surah Al-Insan. I'm going to be jumping right there. Okay. All the way to Surah Al-Insan. I'm going to go Surah Al-Insan. We're going to go Surah Al-Insan. Dathir and Al-Insan. Right there. And let's see. We're in Surah Al-Insan. Okay, here we go. Here we go. This is where he's taking me. إن هؤلاء يحبون العاجلة ويذرون وراءهم يوما ثقيلا. So that's basically in relationship to this ayah. من آثر العاجلة على الآخرة فهو الجاهل. Okay, so wait a minute. So when you say al-ajil, al-ajil means to expedite something. Expedite what? They expedited certain entertainment, amusement, certain things. And what did they do? يحبون العاجلة. They love العاجلة. Basically, it also can mean that it is part of our instinct that we want things to happen quickly. We want to rush things. We don't have that sabr, don't have that patience, even the reward. And that's why it's important when raising children, for example, when they do a good thing, don't necessarily give them the reward right away. Sometimes delay the reward to let them learn that the reward doesn't always have to be expedited. وَيَذَرُونَ وَرَاءَهُمْ يَوْمًا ثَقِيلًا. And they would leave behind a day that is heavy. What do you mean heavy day? Meaning loaded with a lot of accountability, loaded with a lot of stress on Judgment Day, basically. نَحْنُ خَلَقْنَاهُمْ وَشَدَدْنَا أَسْرَهُم. We had created them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَشَدَدْنَا أَسْرَهُم, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically enhanced a number of different things in their creation. Okay. وَإِذَا شِئْنَا بَدَّلْنَا أَمْثَالَهُم تَبْدِيلًا. If we had willed, we had basically created a new creation similar to them, but a new creation. In other words, we're talking about a new generation. إِنَّ هَذِهِ تَذْكِرَةٌ فَمَنْ شَاءَ اتَّخَذَ إِلَى رَبِّهِ سَبِيلًا. This is a reminder. Whoever wants to take basically a path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically the one to be in success. Okay, let's go. And that ayah was basically, you want to keep in mind that sometimes in the ayat, just like in Surah An-Nur, Surah أنزلناها وفرضناها وأنزلنا, and it goes on. But it basically takes you from the back end and then starts to lay out the beginning. So think of it as a trailer. Okay. And that's the same thing. It was telling you about these people and why they were acted like that. But then the ayah really starts out with إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْقُرْآنَ تَنزِيلًا. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed the Quran, and the word tanzila is telling us that it was in a gradual process. It wasn't all together. And that's basically to let us know as well that when you want to commit faith, you can't do everything all at once. And for those that are reverts, take it step by step. You can't do the complete change and absolute change all at once. The day that you become Muslim, you want to do everything all together. You take it in small portions. Learn and embrace little by little. Consider different things, and especially the major sins. Those are things that you completely want to work on avoiding completely. Whether we're speaking about, of course, zina, we're speaking about shirk, we're speaking about magic, we're speaking about drinking, those things you completely want to wean yourself off of ASAP. Okay. And work on it. Okay. But when you look at نحن نزلنا عليك القرآن تنزيلا, taking, of course, the Quran was revealed in 23 years. فاصبر لحكم ربك ولا تطع منهم آثما أو كفورا. Ladies, look at this one. So be patient on the orders of your Lord Almighty. Definitely there's going to be some trade-off. You're going to have to give up on certain things, and there's going to be some pain to endure. فاصبر لحكم ربك ولا تطع منهم آثما أو كفورا. And don't obey. So now, what are you going to do? You're basically going to change the environment that you're surrounding yourself with. لا تطع منهم آثما. Don't obey the people that are of sin and the people that are of disbelief. What are you going to do? You're basically going to isolate yourself from these people. They're supposed to be the ones that are canceled out of your orbit. Which ones? Il-Athim, which could be a Muslim, but they're basically people of sin. أو كفورة, or a person that is of disbelief. Certainly, a person that is athim could maybe a person that is fun to be around. Why? Because they're always saying these silly, funny jokes, and yeah, it's so fun to be around these types of people. And yeah, they're not taking anything seriously. So, they'll say these bad words and think of it as basically cool, funny, and to them, there's no limit. That's okay, don't take it too seriously. And then it will basically affect you without you realizing that, yeah, don't take it a big deal. Come on. There's nothing wrong with it. It's okay. I mean, oh, come on, seriously. You're gonna tell me that wearing these types of clothes is gonna be haram, it's gonna lead you to hellfire? Nah, that's silly. No, don't even say that. They'll basically use these things, and then little by little you're taking off your hijab. Little by little you start stopping to pray. Little by little, here we go. Smoking comes in, and guys come in, and blah blah blah, and all these different things. And yeah, social media, and yeah, so it really started out with, yeah, if you basically have a certain pose on social media, started out with hanging out with these types of friends and blah blah blah, all these different things. And here we go. What happened? They basically had a certain influence. That's why the ayah said, وَلَا تُطِعْ مِنْهُمْ آثِمًا أَوْ كَفُورًا. Don't obey them. Don't even put them within your circle of friends. Even if they're Muslim, they're committing sin, don't put them as within your circle of friends. أَوْ كَفُورًا, or even the disbelievers. You can't have a disbeliever be your best friend. There's no way. There's no way. Because a best friend is supposed to be a friend that comes from the center of faith. They're going to give you an advice that is based on Tawheed, based on Islam. If that person cannot do that, they cannot be a best friend. They can be a good acquaintance. Why not? وَاذْكُرِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ بُكْرَةً وَأَصِيلًا, and mention your Lord Almighty throughout the day and throughout the night. So what does that mean? You've got a centricity that you surround yourself with. And that's basically the Salihin. So why did I relate this ayah with the ayah that we were working on? Because he was talking about this to indicate, well, what type of people do we surround ourselves with? So let's go back to that ayah and see 143. Alhamdulillah, we're still remembering that, right? فَأَنَّهُ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. Okay, فَأَنَّهُ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ was a قراءة, and وَكَذَلِكَ أَنَّهُ مَنْ عَمِلَ وَافَ. Okay, right there, إِنَّهُ, I guess, إذا دخل. Okay, hold on. So you got different قراءات on this one, so I'll skip that one. Oh, Ustaz Omar, you wanted to say something, dear. Go ahead.
Yeah, Bismillah. When it said that كتب ربكم على نفسه الرحمة, does it mean that قضى? And we know that when he made qada for his creation, not for himself.
So there are different scholars that say, like, for example, like katabatu min qada, and some scholars, I would say, go really particular, and they would say kataba is different than qada, and qada means, more to relate to rulings, and others would, some would actually go in detail. So I'm not going to go into that area. We'll just leave it as kataba to mean he obligated it on himself. But qada, other scholars did say that it also means qada, meaning that he had ordained, meaning that he had decreed, that he had put it as a matter that he had made as something that is the final rule, basically. So certainly that would also be a thing. But then when you go to the scholars of Aqidah, some are particular, and to be honest, Some of those debates are, I would say, futile debates. I would say some of those debates are really exaggerated in trying to be particular. And I can understand how, sometimes certain people can be really particular about, no, it has to be this word, no, it has to be that, it has to be in this way, because our mindsets are different. The way that our minds are created, some would basically be very particular. It's a very, they would be really, really particular in what type of articulation that they may use, but even though it really means the same. We're going to see that in just a bit when it talks about in the other ayat, when it says يقص الحق, or is it يقضي الحق? Okay. Or is it, we've got different قراءات. We've got a قراءة يقضي الحق, and we've got يقص الحق. We're going to see how some scholars were really particular in the actual wording, even though يقص الحق and يقضي الحق, I mean, يقص would mean more to inform you, and يقضي would mean more to lay out a decree, but it really gives me the same the same piece of information, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether he's informing you of it or whether he had decreed it, at the end, it's a matter that is not changeable. It's whether you're being informed of it or whether it was decreed in that way. It's basically going to be, the implication is the same. Okay. But some people are really particular that no, there's a particular way of articulation, and we have to be very particular in how we articulate things. So, I will say, those that were very particular and said, no, don't use kataba to mean qada, and or that, but really the implication is the same. So certainly you can use kataba as to mean qada as well, which basically means to decree.
And the point is not only on كتب but على نفسه. Is it match with the حديث القدسي when he said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala إني حرمت الظلم على نفسي
Absolutely.
نفسي.
Absolutely.
This
But
can
you,
explain.
of course, but I can see where you're coming from. The word ala to mean like upon, to mean that there was something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that there's something that he had committed himself to something. Why, use ala nafsihi. So at the end, when it involves Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we would basically use the term that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had used, and we would just leave it at that and give that honor to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's basically just leaving it at that. You will have some scholars in Aqidah basically go into that debate and all of that. I don't personally like going into that debate. Like I said, sometimes I see it as futile. Sometimes I see it as really just going into details, which they both agree at the implication is that we have to honor Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but then is that honoring Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Just like, for example, when you look at Ash'ari and you look at Ahl al-Hadith, for example, and you look at, the other sects, they would all agree that you're not supposed to do tajseem. What is tajseem? Tarsim is a form of anthropomorphization. Tarsim is basically considering that there's a shape for Allah, that there's a certain, when you say that there's a certain shape, then you're actually saying that there's a certain limit, a certain border. Okay. But then they both agree that you should not do tajsim for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you say yadullahi fawqa aydihim, is by saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a hand, is that tajsim? Or is by saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have a hand, that you just committed tajsim by basically considering that that there's no body. That you just negate it. So and then they'll go into this debate Okay, then they'll go into this debate. Did I just commit tashsim, or did I just commit tashbih, or did I just commit negating and negating Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or negating a certain description of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which basically is it-ta'til. Which one did they commit? They both agree that we shouldn't be committing any of these, but then they have different ways of interpreting those narratives, interpreting those ways of how do I explain this? Okay, so especially when we're talking about Ash'ari, and that's why I personally just like to stick to the text, and I don't like getting into any of those details in the way that I would articulate or probably try to analyze the text in relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it's all ghaib. It's all ghaib. So it makes no sense for me to somehow analyze something that I don't really have enough data about to somehow know how this is applied. So I like to just stick to the text and just say, okay, that's it. Got it. Did I answer that one?
Yeah. Jazakallah khair.
وإياكم. All right, let's continue right there. فأنه غفور رحيم. I don't want to go into the details in that one. فأنه غفور رحيم, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all forgiving and all merciful. But here they kind of went into certain details in grammatical details, let's say it that way. And with grammar, the Arabic grammar is very, very particular. And I would say very intricate details in Lugha Arabiya. So just wanting you to just kind of see when it would basically be فَأَنَّهُ, or is it فَإِنَّهُ? How do we understand that? And does it really give the same meaning? And even, of course, the way it would affect the Ghafur Rahim. At the end, he is all forgiving, all merciful, so they would all agree on that. So but the implication is that meaning that forgiveness belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or is that meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us that information? Okay. That, in other words, it makes it an informative clause to tell us فَأَنَّهُ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ, meaning that that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically giving us that informative clause that He is all forgiving and all merciful. So really, at the end of the day, it's really the same thing. Okay, let's move on right there. وَكَذَلِكَ نُفَصِّلُ الْآيَاتِ. What time is it? 11:41. Oh dear. We really passed the time, didn't we? Just this ayah. Okay. نُفَصِّلُ الْآيَاتِ. Just this ayah, inshallah, will be ending. كَذَلِكَ نُفَصِّلُ الْآيَاتِ. What is نُفَصِّل? Where's that ayah right here? Here we go. This is it right there. وَكَذَلِكَ نُفَصِّلُ الْآيَاتِ وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ. And كذلك نفصل الآيات. This كذلك actually tells us as in such. Okay. In other words, there's a certain paradigm. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us recognize this paradigm, letting us see how things unfold, and letting us see, one, the decree, two, at the end, what this would look like, and letting us see the paradigm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in this world. ولي نفصل الآيات, and gives الآيات. What ayat is it talking about? نفصل. What is نفصل? نفصل actually means to reveal all the different meanings that it contains. So what does that mean? Is this talking about giving us detailed meanings? Or is this telling us that the ayat are giving us detailed ayat to give us in general standards? In other words, is it giving us legal maxims? Or is it really giving us detailed ayat in order وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ? So wait a minute. So نُفَصِّلُ الآيات, which ayat is it giving us this detail in? Well, the other sentence, وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ. وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ. وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ. What's the root? بَانَ. بَانَ actually means to make something clear. So وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ In other words, you're adding, you remember, any addition to the actual verb is basically giving me an addition to a new meaning, right? So الزيادة في المباني زيادة في المعاني. So when you look at لتستبين, that's basically to let us know that this is one, the lam here is to give us the reasoning behind it. تستبين is basically letting us tell us that there is something that is induced. What is induced? It's basically inducing clarity for letting others know the path of al-mujrimin. Wait a minute. So who's al-mujrimin anyways? The root is jarama. Jarama actually means to commit a sin, but that's more of a general word because jarama actually means to get into the parameter that you are not supposed to be in. That's what jarama is. It's different than sa'a. The implication is the same. So if you're confused about it, that's okay. Some people are not obsessed with, articulation and others are. Okay. So the word jarama is to basically get yourself within a certain border. So al-mujrimin, the meme here is basically ism fa'al. It's basically the person that committed this sin, in other words, went into the parameter that they're not supposed to be in, which basically would mean the people that get into sin, that get into the parameters that they were not supposed to be, that they trespass the parameters that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as haram borders. Okay, so al-mujrim, who's the person that goes into trespassing a parameter, a haram border that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set. It's basically a criminal. So a person that engages in a crime is basically a person that goes beyond the law, beyond the parameters that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set. So now when it says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed the different verses in order to bring clarity for the path of those that basically had trespassed the limit. So why did it say لِتَسْتَبِيلَ سَبِيلُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ? Why didn't it say that? Because the inference is the same. If you know what's wrong, then you know what's right. If you're able to recognize this is the wrong path, then you're able to recognize with that inference that if it's not within this parameter, then you're on the right thing. It's exactly the same concept and the same term that Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman was using. Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, what was he saying? Well, he was saying, always asking the Prophet ﷺ about what's wrong to do, what would lead to Jahannam. And the Prophet ﷺ would tell him, well, this would lead to Jahannam, that would lead to Jahannam. He wasn't asking because he wanted to go to Jahannam, but he was asking about what leads to Jahannam because his concept and his way of determining things, he was like, if that leads to Jahannam, if I basically away from the path of al-mujrimeen, then I'm basically within the path or at least the parameters that are considered as safe boundaries. Okay, so when it says وَلِتَسْتَبِينَ سَبِيلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ, in other words, in order for the path of those that are basically trespassing the limit, in order for you to be aware and have the complete clarity of the wrong path, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was giving us the detailed verses in order to let those distinguish between the wrong path and the right path. Why? قُلْ إِنِّي نُهِيتُ أَنْ أَعْبُدَ الَّذِينَ تَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. What's the path of the first thing? Well, number one is shirk. So I was ordered to not, well, I was forbidden, let's say, to worship those that you would invoke or pray to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And say, I do not follow your whims. Then, if I were to do so, that is, I would have been astray, and then I would not be part of those that are guided. Okay, when was the last time that we had said la attabi' or attabi'? It's actually the ayah before it, right there. In attabi'u illa ma yuha ilay. I only follow what was revealed unto me. Tomorrow, inshallah, we're going to get into some details about attabi'u ma yuha ilay and the word ittiba'. And we're also going to be talking about, so for doing sabil al-mujrimin, well, if we're basically exposing sabil al-mujrimin, and what is al-ijram anyways? And yes, okay, it begins with shirk, and then it tells us il-hawa. Remember earlier when we first started, we were talking about number one, the person that is basically misguided or jahiliyyah, they're going to be following idhan, and then they're going to be following their hawa, right? And then the mu'min is going to be following il-wahi, and basically is-salah and the parameters of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's basically laying out the same thing that we were talking about. Here it is. Laying out the same thing that we were talking about and letting us basically be aware that the path of a salah is basically standing on al-wahi. إن أتبع إلا ما يوحى إلي. I would follow al-wahi. Okay? And in terms of action, basically يدعون ربهم بالغداة والعشي. We seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the night and throughout the day. As for the disbelievers or those that are mujrimeen, what are they doing? They're following that speculation, and they are following il-hawa. So with our interpretation, it was basically anticipating that it was taking us into that area. قد ضللت إذا وما أنا من المهتدين. That's basically to let us know that if a person follows basically the shirk or away from al-wahi, then they're going to be basically following al-hawa as in terms of legislation. And then قل إني على بينة من ربي وكذبتم به, and say I am following بينة من ربي. I'm following something that is of a clarity from the Lord Almighty. وكذبتم به ما عندي ما تستعجلون به إن الحكم إلا لله يقص الحق وهو خير الفاصلين. Don't have what you are anticipating or rushing or want to expedite, for the rule is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He would inform of the truth, and he is of the best one, or the one that is superior, to basically bring a distinction. A lot of ambiguity. Stay tuned for tomorrow, because how is that bayyina and kadhabtum bihi? What's the story behind this? What's the story behind this? And is there anything similar to that? Well, inshallah, do that tomorrow. And for now, we'll basically end right here. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. Yeah, you can unmute yourself. I believe Sister Zarina unmuted herself and then by mistake. So I think she unmuted herself by mistake, so I muted her. But yeah. Okay, I'll stop the